The sun was a hammer, and the earth was the anvil. Seta Vane was the nail being driven between them. It had been 2 days, or 3. Time was a vulture circling high overhead, a black speck in a merciless blue. Her world had shrunk to the collar of baked clay around her neck, the searing sky, and the granite indifference of the rocks that littered the badlands beyond Baptism Rock. Her lips were cracked maps of a thirst so profound it had become its own entity, a second self living inside her, a creature of dust and despair. Her tongue was a swollen stone in her mouth. She had tried to pray, but the words turned to grit before they could form. She had tried to curse, but her throat was a kiln. Now she just was. Buried. A barren tree planted in a land that celebrated only fruit. Her hair, once her pride, was a tangled rope of sweat and grime, pulled tight against her scalp by the weight of the dirt packed around her shoulders. They had braided it first, the women of the Brethren, their fingers pious and cruel, whispering of God's will as they wove her shame into a thick, coarse plait. Then the men had dug the hole. Her husband Gideon had not looked at her. He had stared at the horizon, his jaw set like a trap, a man caught between the law of his faith and the ghost of a love he had once sworn. He had been the first to cast a shovelful of earth upon her, a judgment, a finality. The rocks didn't shift, the sun didn't relent. The buzzards drew patient, lazy circles. They knew the ways of the Brethren. They knew what came after the judgment. She had closed her eyes against the glare, and in the red darkness behind her lids, she saw them. The faces. Brother Malachi, his beard a cascade of righteousness, his eyes chips of black ice, proclaiming her an empty vessel, an offense to the Almighty who commanded them to be fruitful and multiply. The women, their faces pinched with a grim satisfaction, some of them friends who had once shared bread with her, now seeing her only as a warning, a failure. Her womb was a tomb, they had said, and so they had made her a tombstone for her own life. She had fought at first, a wild, thrashing thing in the pit, her nails clawing at the hard-packed walls, her voice a raw scream that the vast, empty land swallowed without echo. They had held her down, their hands impersonal and strong, until the dirt rose past her knees, her waist, her breasts. They packed it tight, tamping it down with the backs of their shovels, securing her in the earth's unforgiving embrace. When it reached her chin, they stopped. Brother Malachi had knelt, his face close to hers, the smell of sweat and sanctimony thick in the air. "Here you shall remain until the Lord's judgment is complete," he had intoned, his voice a low rumble of authority. "If he deems you worthy of his mercy, he will send a flood to wash you clean. If not, he will send his Son to purify your sin." He had placed a single dried rose on the mound of her burial, a mocking effigy of the bridal flowers she had once carried. Then they had turned their backs and walked away, their silhouettes shrinking into the shimmering heat haze, leaving her to God's will. But God had not sent a flood. He had sent the sun, and the sun was a slow, meticulous executioner. Her skin blistered, her thoughts frayed. She drifted in and out of a fevered state, where memories and hallucinations bled into one another. She saw her mother's face, weeping. She saw the cradle Gideon had carved for their first child, a child that never came, hanging empty and accusing on the wall of their small cabin. She saw a river, cool and clear, and wept dust when she tried to drink from it. Sometimes she thought she felt the earth shift, a deep tremor from below, and she would pray for it to open and swallow her whole, to finish the job. But the ground held her fast. It was a part of her now. She was a part of it. A grotesque statue of despair. It was the sound that brought her back. A rhythmic clinking, a creak of leather, not the sound of the Brethren. Their movements were heavy, deliberate. This was different, slower, weighed down by something other than piety. She forced her swollen eyelids open. A shape wavered in the heat, a dark mirage against the blinding glare. A man on a tired-looking mule. And behind him, 2 smaller figures in a rickety cart pulled by a second equally weary animal. The mirage solidified. a man, and 2 children. They were not brethren. His hat was wide-brimmed and battered, not the stark black of Malachi's flock. His clothes were faded denim and worn leather, not homespun judgment. He stopped a dozen yards from her, his mule sighing as it lowered its head. The man just sat there for a long moment, surveying the scene. His face was weathered, carved by sun and sorrow, a landscape of its own. He looked at her, and his eyes held no judgment, no pity, just a deep, quiet seeing. He saw the packed earth. He saw the dried rose. He saw the woman buried to her neck in the heart of nowhere. The 2 children in the cart were still. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, with his father's serious eyes, stared at her with a stark, unnerving intensity. A girl, younger, perhaps 5 or 6, hid her face in the boy's side, peeking out from behind his arm. Her small shadow stretched across the baked ground, falling just short of the mound. A child's shadow across a grave. The man swung a long leg over the mule and slid to the ground. He moved with a weariness that went bone deep, but there was no hesitation in his steps. He walked toward her, his boots scuffing the dust. He stopped just before her, his shadow falling over her face, a momentary blessed relief from the sun. He knelt, just as Malachi had, but his face was different. There was a kindness in the lines around his eyes, a sorrow that recognized her own. He didn't speak. He reached out and his thumb, calloused and rough, gently brushed the dirt from her cheek. It was the first human touch she had felt that was not an act of violence. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, it broke something inside her. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the grime. He stood up and walked back to the cart. He took a canteen from its side. It was old, dented, with a crack running down its side, held together with pitch. He uncorked it and knelt beside her again. He tilted it slowly, letting a few precious drops of water fall onto her lips. It was agony and ecstasy. The water was warm, but it was life. It stung her cracked skin, but it soothed the fire in her throat. She tried to swallow, a painful, rasping sound. He gave her more, a little at a time, patient as a man tending a dying plant. The little girl in the cart had lowered her arm. She watched, her expression a mixture of fear and fascination. The boy remained stoic, his gaze fixed on his father. The man, Ira, stood again. He looked back at his children. "Caleb," he said, his voice low and raspy from disuse, "stay with Elodie." He walked to the back of the cart and pulled something from it. It was long, wooden, with a metal head that glinted in the sun. A shovel. He didn't look at her. He just walked to the edge of the mound, planted his feet, and drove the shovel into the hard-packed earth. The sound was a thunderclap in the silence, the first strike of metal against the prison that held her. It was not the sound of a grave being dug, but of one being unmade. Each thrust of the shovel was a word in a language she had forgotten. Mercy, hope. Each shovelful of dirt tossed aside was a piece of her sentence being revoked. The rocks didn't shift. The sun still blistered her lips. But the stranger who rode in with 2 children, he did. And he brought a shovel. He worked with a steady, relentless rhythm, the muscles in his back and shoulders cording under his thin shirt. Sweat soaked the fabric, tracing the lines of his spine. He was not a young man. There was a stiffness in his movements, an ache she could almost feel in her own bones. But he did not stop. The dirt flew, a spray of brown against the blue sky. The mound around her began to shrink. The pressure on her chest lessened with every shovelful. The boy, Caleb, had climbed down from the cart. He stood a few feet away, watching his father, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked from the man to the woman in the ground, his face a mask of confusion and a nascent anger. The little girl, Elodie, remained in the cart, her small face pale. She clutched a bundle of what looked like dried flowers. It took a long time. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and red. The heat lessened, but the man's labor did not. He was breathing heavily now, his movements slower but no less determined. The dirt was down to her waist. He stopped, leaning on the shovel, his chest heaving. He looked at her, his eyes asking a question she couldn't answer. He saw the raw, chafed skin of her shoulders, the way she slumped, held up only by the remaining earth. He put the shovel aside and knelt again. "Can you move your arms?" he asked. His voice was gentle. She tried, a flicker of movement, a spasm of pain. The muscles had been locked in place for too long. She shook her head, a tiny, jerky motion. He nodded, his expression grim. He began to dig again, but this time with his hands, scooping away the dirt from around her torso, careful not to scrape her skin. The earth was cool now, almost a comfort against her fevered body. He worked until her arms were free. They lay limp at her sides, caked in mud, the blood from her torn fingernails long dried. Her fists were still clenched, so tight the knuckles were white beneath the grime, clenched around the memory of the fight she had lost. He worked his way down, freeing her hips, her legs. When she was finally loose, a collapsed thing in the bottom of the pit, he reached down. His hands were strong, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he hooked his arms under hers. "Easy now," he murmured. He lifted her. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a thing of bone and brittle skin. Her legs wouldn't hold. She collapsed against him, her head lolling against his chest. The world spun, a dizzying vortex of color and shadow. She was aware of the smell of him, dust and sweat and something else, something like clean earth and pine. It was the smell of life. He carried her to the cart and laid her down gently in the back, on a bed of old blankets. The little girl, Elodie, shrank back into the corner, her eyes wide. The man pulled a blanket over Seta, covering her nakedness, her shame. He went back to the hole and retrieved his shovel. He didn't fill the hole. He left it open, a gaping wound in the earth, a testament to what had been done there. He picked up the single dried rose that had fallen to the side and walked back to the cart. He looked at it for a moment, his expression unreadable, then tossed it into the open grave. He climbed onto the mule. Caleb climbed back into the cart, sitting beside his sister, his back ramrod straight. He did not look at Seta. The man, Ira, clicked his tongue, and the mule started forward, pulling the cart behind it. The wheels creaked, a mournful song in the twilight. Seta lay in the back, drifting, the rhythmic jolting of the cart a strange, painful lullaby. The last thing she saw before her eyes slid shut was the sky, now a deep, bruised purple, filled with the first sharp pinpricks of stars. They were cold and distant, but they were no longer circling. The journey was a blur of pain and disjointed sensation. The rumble of the wheels through her bones, the scratch of the wool blanket against her raw skin, the low murmur of the man's voice speaking to his children. She floated in a half-conscious state, a place between the hell she had left and a future she could not imagine. At some point, she felt the cool rim of the canteen against her lips again, and she drank, the water a sacrament. Once, she woke to the feeling of a small, hesitant hand touching her hair. She opened her eyes a crack and saw the little girl, Elodie, her face inches from hers, her expression one of solemn curiosity. The girl held out her hand. In her palm were the crushed remains of the dried flowers Seta had seen her clutching earlier. Wild roses, faded and brittle. The girl gently placed them on the blanket beside Seta's head, a child's offering. Then she scrambled back to her brother's side. They traveled through the night. The air grew cold, and Seta shivered uncontrollably. The man stopped the cart and draped another blanket over her, his movements efficient and impersonal. He was not her savior. He was just a man who had found something broken on the side of the road and had chosen not to leave it there. That, she was beginning to understand, was a miracle in itself. She woke to stillness. The cart was no longer moving. The air smelled of wood smoke and dust. She was in a small, dark space, a barn. Shafts of early morning light cut through the cracks in the wooden walls, illuminating dancing dust motes. The man was there, his back to her, tending to the mules. He moved with the same weary grace she had seen before. He finished his work and turned to her. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried to push herself up. Her arms trembled, her muscles screamed in protest. She managed to sit, the world tilting precariously. He came and helped her, his arm a firm support under her own. He helped her out of the cart, and her feet touched the ground. Her legs buckled instantly. He caught her, holding her up. She leaned against him, her weakness a profound humiliation. He half carried her out of the barn and into the sunlight. It was a homestead, stark and isolated, nestled in a shallow, rocky valley. A small, rough-hewn cabin stood against a backdrop of towering mesas, their red faces glowing in the morning sun. A small corral held a single, bony cow. A patch of struggling vegetables grew near the cabin door. It was a place of survival, not prosperity, a place of exile. The children were by the cabin door, watching. The boy, Caleb, still guarded. The girl, Elodie, a little more open. Ira helped her to the cabin, his arm a steady presence around her waist. The door creaked open onto a single room. It was sparse and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough wooden table and 2 benches stood in the center. 2 small cots were pushed against one wall. A larger bed, neatly made, was in the corner. And on the wall above that bed, hanging from a wooden peg, was a cradle. It was beautifully made, the wood smooth and polished, but it was empty. It hung there like a question that had never been answered, a silent testament to a grief that filled the small room. Ira led her to a chair by the cold hearth. "Sit," he said. He went to the fireplace and began to build a fire, his movements practiced and sure. He filled a large kettle with water from a bucket and hung it over the flames. He did not speak. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the kindling and the whisper of the wind outside. Seta sat, her hands limp in her lap. She looked at her body, at the dirt and grime that caked her skin, at the raw, chafed wounds. She was a ruin, a thing dug up from the earth. She looked at the cradle on the wall, and the ache in her own empty womb was a physical pain, a hot, sharp thing that took her breath away. She understood. This man, this stranger, he knew this same hollowness. He lived with it every day. When the water was hot, he poured it into a large wooden tub. He added cold water from the bucket until it was steaming. He placed a bar of lye soap and a rough cloth beside it. He looked at her. "The children and I will be outside," he said. He turned to his children. "Caleb, Elodie, come." He herded them out the door, closing it softly behind him. She was alone. Alone with the warm water, the soap, the silence, and the cradle. Slowly, painfully, she stood. She shed the filthy blanket and stepped into the tub. The water was a shock, a burning, cleansing fire. She scrubbed at her skin, the lye soap stinging her wounds, but it was a clean pain. She washed the badlands from her body, the judgment of the brethren, the touch of their hands. She washed her hair, working her fingers through the thick, matted rope, untangling the knots of shame and despair. It took a long time. The water turned brown with filth. When she was done, she stepped out, her skin pink and raw, but clean. She was weak, trembling, but she was no longer a part of the earth. She was herself again. There were clothes laid out on the large bed, a simple homespun dress, worn soft with washing, undergarments. They were too big for her, but they were clean. She dressed slowly, her movements stiff and awkward. She felt fragile, like a newborn foal. She looked at herself in the small, cracked piece of mirror hanging by the door. A stranger looked back. A woman with haunted eyes, her face gaunt and pale, her hair a wild, damp mane around her shoulders. But a woman nonetheless. She opened the door and stepped outside. The sun was higher now, but it felt different. A warmth, not a threat. Ira was sitting on the porch steps, sharpening a knife. The children were nearby. Caleb was throwing stones at a can. Elodie was arranging a circle of pebbles on the ground. They all looked up as she emerged. Ira stopped his work. He looked at her, at the clean dress, the damp hair. A flicker of something passed through his eyes, something she couldn't name. He just nodded, as if to himself. "There's stew on the fire," he said. She ate. She had never tasted anything so good. It was just rabbit and root vegetables, but it was food. It was life. She ate slowly, savoring every bite. The children ate in silence, Caleb still watching her with suspicion, Elodie with a shy curiosity. Ira ate with the same quiet intensity he did everything else. The days that followed fell into a slow, quiet rhythm. There were no explanations asked for, none given. Her past was a ghost that haunted the edges of their small world, but they did not speak its name. Ira gave her small tasks to do, mending the children's clothes, weeding the small garden, grinding corn. The work was a balm. It gave her a purpose beyond just surviving. It anchored her to the present. She learned the landscape of their lives. Ira was a man who spoke little, but his actions were a language of their own. He was a good father. He was patient with Elodie, who followed him like a shadow. He was firm but fair with Caleb, who was a bundle of coiled anger and grief. She saw the way he looked at the empty cradle sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, and the sorrow in his face was so profound it made her own heart ache in sympathy. She learned about his wife, Sarah, not from words, but from the things she had left behind. The faded quilt on the bed, stitched with careful, loving hands. A small, carved bird on the mantelpiece. The way Ira would sometimes pause, his gaze distant, and Seta knew he was seeing a face she would never know. He had been cast out, too. She pieced it together from overheard whispers between the children. He had defied his own people, a different sect, one that believed in a harsh, unforgiving God, much like her own. He had refused to let them shun a family for a debt they couldn't pay. For that act of mercy, he had been declared an outcast. He had taken his wife and his children and come to this desolate place to build a new life. But the Badlands had taken Sarah, a fever that had burned through her in a matter of days. He had buried her himself, on the ridge overlooking the cabin. Seta found the grave one afternoon, a simple wooden cross with the name Sarah Doss carved into it, and at its base, a small, overturned jar with the withered stems of old wildflowers. This was his sorrow, a mirror to her own. She had been buried for her barrenness. He was a widower, left to raise 2 children in a world that had turned its back on him. They were 2 sides of the same coin of loss. Her strength returned slowly. The gauntness in her face began to fill out. The haunted look in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. She began to learn the children. Elodie was easy to love. She was a bright, curious child, full of questions and laughter. She would bring Seta small gifts, a pretty rock, a bird's feather, a handful of wildflowers. She started calling her Seta, her small voice turning the name into something soft and new. Caleb was harder. He was his father's son, quiet and watchful, but his silence was laced with resentment. He saw her as an intruder, another mouth to feed, another burden on his father. He ignored her, his small face set in a permanent scowl. He was the keeper of his mother's memory, and he guarded it fiercely. Seta did not push him. She gave him space. She simply existed in his world, mending his torn shirts, placing food before him at the table, her presence a quiet, steady thing. One evening, a storm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind howled around the small cabin, rattling the door in its frame. Lightning split the darkness, followed by deafening cracks of thunder. Elodie, terrified, scrambled into Ira's lap, burying her face in his chest. Caleb sat by the fire, pretending to be brave, but Seta saw the way he flinched at every thunderclap. The storm raged for hours. Ira held Elodie, murmuring soothing words to her. Seta sat across from them, watching the fire, the flickering light playing across their faces. In that small, storm-tossed cabin, they were a family, a strange, broken, cobbled-together family. During a particularly loud crash of thunder, Caleb jumped. A small cry escaped his lips. He looked up, his eyes wide with fear, and for a moment, his gaze met Seta's. She didn't say anything. She just held his gaze, her expression one of quiet understanding. She knew what it was to be afraid. He looked away quickly, his scowl returning, but something had shifted between them. A small crack in the wall he had built around himself. The next day, he spoke to her for the first time. She was in the garden, pulling weeds. He came and stood beside her. "You're doing it wrong," he said, his voice gruff. "You have to get the whole root." He knelt beside her and showed her, his small, deft fingers working the stubborn root from the soil. They worked in silence for a while, side by side. It was a beginning. The seasons began to turn. The brutal heat of summer gave way to the crisp, cool air of autumn. The mesas burned with a fiery light in the evenings. Seta's hair grew long and thick. She braided it now, not as a symbol of shame, but as a matter of practicality. The act of weaving the strands together was a quiet meditation, a reclaiming of herself. She and Ira rarely spoke of anything personal. Their conversations were about the necessities of life, the harvest, the weather, the mending that needed to be done. But a current of understanding flowed between them, a silent acknowledgement of their shared exile, their shared grief. Sometimes, their hands would brush as they worked, and a jolt of awareness would pass between them, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. One afternoon, she found him in the barn, his hand resting on the empty cradle, which he had taken down from the wall. He was sanding a small, rough patch on the wood, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't seem to notice her at first. His face was a mask of sorrow, so raw and unguarded it made her stop in the doorway. "It was for our third," he said, his voice low, not looking at her. "Sarah, she was with child when she passed." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. Seta's own barrenness was a fresh wound. She had been condemned for what this woman had died for. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. She didn't know what to say. She just stood there, her heart aching for him, for the wife he had lost, for the child that never was. He looked up at her then, his eyes full of a pain that mirrored her own. "It is not a curse, Seta," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "What happened to you? It was not God's will. It was the will of cruel men." It was the first time he had acknowledged her past directly. The words were a gift, a validation she didn't know she needed. They broke down the last of her defenses. She walked over to him, and he stood. They stood in the dusty, quiet barn, the empty cradle between them, and for the first time, she did not feel like an outcast. She felt seen. The peace was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold river. She knew it could not last. The brethren were not men who forgot. Their judgment was absolute. Their God was a jealous God, and she had defied him by surviving. The rider came on a cold, gray morning in late autumn. He was a speck on the horizon for a long time, a slow-moving threat. Ira saw him first. He was chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat in the quiet morning. He stopped, the axe held motionless in his hand, his gaze fixed on the approaching figure. Seta was hanging laundry on a line, the clean sheets snapping in the wind. She saw the look on his face, and her blood ran cold. "Caleb," Ira said, his voice sharp. "Take your sister inside, now!" Caleb, who had been helping Seta, didn't hesitate. He grabbed Elodie's hand and pulled her toward the cabin. He cast one fearful look back at his father, then disappeared inside. Seta stood frozen, her hands still clutching a damp sheet. The rider was closer now. She could see the stark black of his clothes, the rigid set of his shoulders. He was from Baptism Rock. He was a messenger. Ira walked to the porch and picked up the shotgun that was always leaning by the door. He didn't raise it. He just held it, its weight a comfort in his hand. He stood on the porch, waiting. The rider stopped his horse a dozen yards from the cabin, just as Ira had stopped his mule all those months ago. But this man's eyes held no mercy. They were cold, flat, and full of righteous certainty. It was Gideon, her husband. He looked different, thinner. His face was drawn, his eyes hollowed out. But the weakness she saw in him was gone, replaced by a hard, brittle piety. He did not look at Ira. His gaze was fixed on Seta. "She lives," he said. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "She does," Ira replied, his voice calm and steady. Gideon's eyes flickered to Ira, a flash of contempt. "You have harbored an abomination. You have interfered with the judgment of God." "I interfered with the cruelty of men," Ira said, his voice low and dangerous. "There is a difference." Gideon's gaze swung back to Seta. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a ghost of the man she had married, a flicker of pain, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Brother Malachi has sent me. He says the Lord's will has been thwarted. He says the purification was not complete." He paused, his words hanging in the cold air. "We are coming, Seta. We are coming to finish God's will." He stared at her for a long moment, his face a mask of cold duty. Then he turned his horse and rode away, without another word, without a backward glance. He disappeared over the ridge, leaving a profound and terrible silence in his wake. Seta felt the world tilt. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, unstable. The hole. They were coming to put her back in the hole. The terror was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing her heart, stealing her breath. She swayed, and Ira was there, his hand on her arm, steadying her. "Seta." His voice was firm, pulling her back from the edge. "Look at me." She forced her eyes to meet his. His face was grim, but there was no fear in his eyes, only a cold, hard resolve. "You are not going back in that hole," he said. It was a promise, a vow. The next few days were a blur of tense waiting. The sky was a constant, oppressive gray. The wind moaned around the cabin, a mournful, keening sound. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Sleep was a luxury none of them could afford. Ira was a silent, coiled spring of readiness. He cleaned and oiled the shotgun. He sharpened the axe until its edge glinted with a deadly light. He boarded up the small window in the back of the cabin. He was not preparing for a fight. He was preparing for a siege. The children felt the tension. Elodie was quiet, clinging to Seta's side, her small face pale with a fear she didn't understand. Caleb was a different story. The resentment was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective anger. He followed his father everywhere, his young face a miniature of Ira's grim resolve. He practiced with his slingshot, his aim becoming deadly accurate, pinging stones off a can with a relentless rhythm. Seta moved through the days in a fog of dread. The memory of the dirt, the sun, the thirst, was a constant presence. She would wake in the night gasping for breath, the feeling of being buried suffocating her. But then she would see Ira, sitting by the dying fire, the shotgun across his lap, his silhouette a guardian in the darkness. And she would see the children, sleeping in their cots, their breath a soft, rhythmic sound. And she knew she could not fall apart. She had something to fight for now. Not just her own life, but this life. This strange, broken, beautiful life they had built together in this desolate place. She found her own resolve. She baked bread, she cooked meals, she mended clothes, she brought a sense of normalcy to their besieged world, a quiet defiance against the coming storm. She braided her hair every morning, her fingers steady, the act a small ritual of strength. She would not be a victim, she would not be a symbol of shame. She was Seta Vane, and she would not be buried again. They came on the fourth day. At dawn, a line of black figures on the ridge, silhouetted against the blood-red sunrise. There were 5 of them. Brother Malachi was at their head, his tall, gaunt frame unmistakable even at a distance. Gideon was beside him. The other 3 were men she recognized, elders of the brethren, their faces set in grim, righteous lines. They carried shovels and stones. Ira stood on the porch, the shotgun held loosely in his hands. Seta stood beside him. She was terrified, but she would not hide. She would face them. Caleb stood in the doorway behind them, his slingshot in his hand, a small, fierce warrior ready to defend his home. Elodie was hidden under the bed, told to stay there no matter what she heard. The 5 men rode down into the valley, their horses' hooves a slow, deliberate drumbeat of doom. They stopped a dozen yards from the cabin, the same spot Gideon had stopped before, the same spot Ira had stopped. But this time, there was no mercy in the air, only judgment. Brother Malachi dismounted, his black coat flapping in the wind like the wings of a crow, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire, fixed on Seta. "The harlot!" he boomed, his voice echoing in the quiet valley. "You have defiled this land with your presence. You have mocked the will of the Almighty." "The only thing she has defiled is your pride, Malachi," Ira said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You sentenced an innocent woman, and you were wrong." Malachi's lip curled in a sneer. "Innocent. She is a barren field, a curse upon the land. The Lord commanded her purification, and you," he spat the word, "you interfered. You are as guilty as she is." "Then you will have to deal with me," Ira said. He raised the shotgun, the 2 black holes of its barrels pointing directly at Malachi's chest. A flicker of surprise, of fear, crossed Malachi's face. He had expected a farmer, a broken man, not this cold, quiet defiance. Gideon stepped forward, his face pale, his hands clenched. "Seta," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Do not do this. Do not let this man's sin be your own. Come back. Accept the Lord's will. It will be quick." Seta looked at her husband, at the man who had thrown dirt on her, who had left her to die, and she felt nothing. Not love, not hate, only a vast, empty pity. "My will is my own, Gideon," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying on the wind. "And the Lord I know is a God of mercy, not of stones and shovels." Malachi's face contorted with rage. "Blasphemy!" he roared. "She is lost! Seize her! Finish the judgment!" 2 of the men started to dismount, their faces grim. Ira cocked both hammers of the shotgun. The sound, 2 sharp, metallic clicks, was deafening in the silence. "The first man who takes another step is dead," Ira said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I will not tell you again." The men froze. They were men of faith, but they were also men of flesh and blood. They looked at Ira's face, at the cold certainty in his eyes, and they saw their own mortality. Malachi hesitated. This was not how it was supposed to be. There was supposed to be repentance, fear, submission, not this, not a shotgun and a man who looked like he had nothing left to lose. "He cannot shoot all of us," Malachi snarled at his men. "God is on our side." But the men did not move. The certainty had gone out of their eyes, replaced by a dawning fear. And then, a new sound, a sharp thwack. One of the men cried out and clapped a hand to his cheek, a small trickle of blood running between his fingers. Everyone looked toward the cabin door. Caleb stood there, his small face a mask of fury, his slingshot raised. He was already loading another stone. The standoff stretched, a taut wire of tension. The wind howled, whipping dust around them. The sun climbed higher, a cold white disk in the gray sky. It was Gideon who broke. He looked at Seta, standing tall and defiant beside the man who had saved her. He looked at the boy in the doorway, ready to fight for her. He looked at the cold, hard face of his faith in the form of Brother Malachi, and something inside him shattered. "Enough!" he whispered, then louder. "Enough! Leave her be!" Malachi turned on him, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Traitor! You would side with the sinner?" "She is my wife," Gideon said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "and we have done enough." He turned his horse, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and began to ride away. One by one, the other 2 men followed, their resolve broken. They turned their horses and rode after Gideon, leaving Malachi alone, his face a thundercloud of impotent rage. He stared at Ira and Seta, his chest heaving. "This is not over," he hissed. "God's judgment will not be mocked. He will see you both burn for this." He spat on the ground, turned and mounted his horse, riding off after his retreating flock. They were gone. The threat had passed. The valley was silent again, save for the sound of the wind. Seta's legs gave out. She sank to her knees on the porch, the strength draining out of her in a rush. Ira lowered the shotgun, his hands trembling slightly. He knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. Caleb ran out, his slingshot forgotten, and threw his arms around Seta's neck, burying his face in her shoulder. She held him tight, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs, not of fear, of relief, of a victory she had never thought possible. Ira's hand was warm on her back, a steady, comforting presence. They stayed like that for a long time, a strange, battered trinity on the porch of the small cabin, while the sun burned through the clouds and flooded the valley with a clean, new light. Later, inside the cabin, the silence was different. It was not a silence of tension or fear, but of peace, a deep, earned peace. Elodie had emerged from under the bed and was now sitting in Seta's lap, her small arms wrapped around her waist. Ira was cleaning the shotgun, his movements slow and methodical. Seta was tending to a small cut on his hand, a scrape he'd gotten on the porch rail. She wrapped a clean strip of cloth around it, her touch gentle. Their world had been threatened, and it had held. They had held. The fire crackled in the hearth, a warm, living heart in the center of their home. The empty cradle still hung on the wall, but it no longer looked like a symbol of loss. It looked like a promise, a possibility, a space waiting to be filled, not with a child of blood, but with a family of choice. Seta finished tying the bandage. She looked up at Ira, and their eyes met. In his gaze, she saw not a savior, not a stranger, but a partner. A man who had stood between her and the stones. A man who had shown her what love looked like, not in sermons, but in deeds. Caleb, who had been watching them from his cot, slid off and came to her side. He stood there for a moment, his young face serious. He looked at her hand resting on Ira's. He reached out his own small hand and gently took hers. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. It was acceptance. It was belonging. The boy held her hand and called her Ma before she could speak.